The paper today, for the sake of time, let me not give much of a preface. One is that this paper may feel more secular than you were hoping for, but one of my degrees is in communications, and so definitions and terminology are very important to me. So when we speak about addiction, I want to make sure that we're all speaking on the same playing field. The other is that I'm speaking about shame primarily here, and shame is a universal emotion. We've all felt it, and in almost every presentation I've given, it's an intense emotional situation for many people, some people at any rate. So if you feel something afterwards, please grab one of us or any of us and talk and bring it out. This paper is an abbreviated attempt to present common perceptions about addiction, professional opinions into the nature of addiction, and recent studies in psychology and social work on the impact of shame and guilt upon addictive behavior. Pastoral approaches addressing addiction are beyond the scope of this paper. However, without clear insight into the underlying psychological influences, difficulties will persist when attempting to provide pastoral care to an individual suffering addiction. Informed Americans are painfully aware of the human and financial cost of drug and alcohol addiction to families and society. The economic costs of unrelated, trauma-related alcohol and drug abuse alone were estimated at $161 billion in 2000. Sharon Wegscheider-Cruz defines codependence as all persons who, 1, are in love or marriage relationships with an alcoholic, 2, have one or more alcoholic parents or grandparents, or 3, grew up in an emotionally repressive family. According to Wegscheider-Cruz, this includes 96% of the population. Yet, drugs and alcohol represent only 2 addictive behaviors exhibited today: food, sex, pornography, gambling, video games, compulsive spending, and more can all be taken to a level of addiction, destroying families, relationships, and the quality of life for the individual addict. More recent statistics indicate that we have a persistent dilemma. In the United States, up to 60% of adults report experiencing abuse or other difficult family circumstances during childhood. 26% of children will witness or experience a traumatic event before they turn 4. As the number of traumatic events experienced during childhood increases, the risk for the following health problems in adulthood also increase: depression, alcoholism, drug abuse, suicide attempts, heart and liver diseases, pregnancy problems, high stress, uncontrollable anger, and family, financial, and drug problems. As a national anti-drug campaign, Just Say No gained the name from the response of First Lady Nancy Reagan to a 4th grade student in Oakland, California. The underlying premise of the campaign remained that addiction will not occur if total abstinence is maintained from any specific substance. Just Say No did something insidious. It reduced the debate to a single word: don't talk about why people use drugs. 2 examples from recent American history reinforce the idea that substance should be of less importance than the underlying emotional state of the individual. In one instance, the New York Times reported throughout 1971 of the looming danger of up to 60,000 soldiers returning from Vietnam as heroin junkies. Yet, most of those who had been addicts in Vietnam simply stopped using when they got home. About Vietnam, Lance Dotis states that addiction is a human problem that resides in people, not in the drug or in the drug's capacity to produce physical effects. For the returning soldiers, even when they had used drugs as physically addictive as heroin, even in the face of the cravings known to be associated with withdrawal from this drug, once they were out of their abnormally stressful setting, addictive behavior could not be created in them. The second example came in the wake of health statements against cigarettes by the Office of the Surgeon General during the 1980s. Since 1980, cigarette consumption in America has fallen more than 60%. Despite nicotine and heroin ranking among the most addictive substances known, the 2 examples cited above show that significant numbers of Americans have quit smoking cigarettes or using heroin without aid or rehabilitation. Dotis claims that for a true addiction to become manifest, a psychological drive must also be present. The essence of the addiction exists separately and independently from the presence of physical effects brought about by the drug itself or by withdrawal from the drug. Detoxification alone will not cure an addict or an alcoholic from their affliction. Relapses are common. More than half of people who go through a treatment program will resume use of alcohol or other drugs following discharge, most often within the first 90 days. Total absence at a year is around 20 to 25% when measuring just alcohol. Switching from one addictive behavior to another is also common. This occurs because, at the core, addictive behavior is a natural human response to a sense of personal impasse. Dotis describes addiction as a psychological displacement of action in the face of feelings of helplessness and inadequacy. When the source of those feelings are identified and resolved, displacement is no longer exercised and addictive impulse evaporates. The particularly judgmental view of addictions that has been prevalent throughout human history has clearly been a reaction to their harmful effects on others. This is because the psychological nature and mechanism of addiction has not been understood. A summary of one of Dotis' case studies will exemplify the effect of displacement and open this study into the impact of shame and guilt. Marion came to him with concerns about a growing dependency on opioids. She was a registered nurse, a mother of two, married to a personnel executive, and the only daughter of a widow living several states away. After an inconclusive series of medical tests for recurring headaches, Marion's physician released her from the hospital with a prescription for Percodan. Separately, her husband had grown accustomed to bringing home colleagues for dinner on short notice. Marion found that when her husband would call home announcing guests for dinner, she would adjust her schedule to accommodate her children, drive to the grocery store, return home, and then run upstairs for Percodan just before dinner. Very often, daily telephone calls from her mother would add to the demands upon her. Important in her therapeutic dialogue, she recalled how her husband had become furious one afternoon when he came home to find her cooking dinner and high on Percodan. He yelled at her, saying that she should be ashamed of herself, concluding, "Do you know what a worthless wife you are?" In tears, she agreed with him. When Dotis asked about lengthy calls from her mother during busy times of the day, she replied, "It's important for my mother to be able to talk about the things on her mind. After all, what sort of person would I be if I didn't listen to my mother at her age?" Eventually, Dr. Dotis asked Marion how long would it take for the Percodan to help. A half an hour after taking the pill? A little longer? After considering the question, Marion realized she felt relief as soon as she committed to the idea, even before taking the medicine. Several weeks into her therapy, Marion arrived for another appointment and was very excited. She said that her husband announced business guests for dinner only the night before, but that she didn't need to take Percodan. Dr. Dotis asked what she had done differently. "I called for Chinese takeout." Her husband was not happy, but she did not need to self-medicate. In the ensuing weeks, Marion gained the courage to confront her husband about his unfair expectations. She suggested he make reservations at one of the many nice restaurants in the city when he wanted to entertain guests. She and the children would be fine and have their dinner at home. She also spoke with her mother and established healthy boundaries for regular telephone conversations that would better fit her schedule so she could concentrate on her mother's needs. Percodan had provided an opportunity for displacement, allowing Marion to avoid confronting her husband and her mother. Her marriage relationship was very important to her, as well as that with her mother. The fear of confrontation and possible damage to either relationship had urged her to follow a more passive approach, but one which did not address the problem. Once she had arrived at a solution with her husband and her mother, she no longer felt any need to take Percodan. The psychological component of the dependency had been resolved. With the innate power of a substance properly diminished and the psychological component of addiction substantially highlighted, current research in self-conscious affect becomes more relevant to the pastoral care of individuals suffering from substance abuse or addictive behavior. Self-conscious affect refers to the personal emotions we experience during moments of self-critique or under the observation of others. These are shame, guilt, humiliation, and embarrassment. With respect to addictive behavior, shame and guilt have significant impact, though in distinct and opposite directions. The terms shame and guilt are often used interchangeably. Even in professional circles and among college students, the concepts of shame and guilt can become confused. Yet, a distinction must be maintained to clearly understand the resulting impact upon addiction. Painful feelings of shame seem to promote self-destructive behaviors that can be viewed as misguided attempts to dampen or escape this most punitive moral emotion. Brene Brown cites an 8-year study by Tangney and Deering. Shame proneness in fifth graders, that is, the susceptibility to shame, was a strong predictor of later school suspension, drug use, and suicide attempts. On the other hand, when they compared children who were guilt-prone, the guilt-prone fifth graders were more likely to later apply to college and to be involved in community service. They were less likely to make suicide attempts, use heroin, or drive under the influence of alcohol or drugs, and they began having sex at a later age. Brown expands upon this finding during a seminar on vulnerability. Shame is highly, highly correlated with addiction, depression, suicide, bullying, aggression, violence, eating disorders. And if that doesn't get your attention enough, guilt is inversely correlated with those outcomes. In fact, shame and addiction are so intimately correlated, we don't know where one starts and the other begins. We don't have a temporal understanding of it. Did you start self-medicating because you were full of shame, or are you full of shame because you're self-medicating? We just know that it's a perfect storm. Shame and addiction are natural partners. The more chronically shamed a person is, the more likely he will be attracted to anything that promises relief from the internal pain and emptiness. Ronald Potter Efron further suggests that shame and addiction often create a negative feedback loop which gradually increases both shame and addictive tendencies. People begin the process when they discover that drinking can serve as a temporary escape from their deeply sensed feelings of inadequacy. Shame drives these persons to drink, and drinking increases their shame in a constantly descending spiral. Guilt is a focus upon bad actions or poor choices. Shame is a focus upon self. Guilt is, I lied to you. Shame is, I'm a liar. Actions causing guilt can be identified in specific instances. Guilt can be rectified through apology, making amends, restitution, or confession. Shame, on the other hand, is incorporated directly into the very fiber of the individual. Shame focuses upon negative perceptions of self and is portrayed as character defects by many 12-step programs. Shame is exposure of negative personal attributes, whether these are real or perceived. This exposure can be outward to others or a sudden inward awareness. Guilt can lead to corrective action. Shame leads to resignation and despair. A sense of failure is a central characteristic of individuals who experience shame or guilt. The deficit is global for shamed persons. It is felt as a failure of being. Excessive shame experiences lead individuals toward feeling inadequate as human beings, as if, when born, God had made a mistake in creating such flawed and defective organisms. The shame crisis is spiritual in that shamed persons question the reason and meaning of their lives, often finding no justification for their existence. People experiencing shame sense they are falling far short of their goals in life. They often reflect internalized parental expectations. Shame occurs when something happens that forces the individual to notice the gap between their actual or anticipated performance and those expectations. In The Addictive Personality, Craig Nakin speaks of the shaming family as one in which members can never do anything right or good enough. Shaming families victimize their members in a routine, systematic way. Shaming families set their members up to be emotionally full of rage and to have, at the same time, a deep sense of sadness. Members of shaming families feel tension in their family system, which often is translated into a general mistrust of human beings. Members of shaming families can develop a secret life. All addicts have a general mistrust of people and have a secret side to themselves. The relationship between shame and parental expectations is an important one, but the connection is not exclusive to parents. Children become affected by social expectations. Our personal moral standards and ideals for the self develop early as a function of key socialization experiences with parents, teachers, and significant others. We learn to feel shame and guilt over failures and transgressions, and these failures and transgressions are themselves defined as such by significant people in our social milieu. It is important to recall that experiences of shame in children can be stored as trauma. According to Shelley Uram, small, quiet trauma can trigger same survival reactions as major tragic events. For a child who lacks life experience, the negative impact of a shaming incident by a significant authority figure can be imprinted into unconscious memory simply because children do not yet possess the vocabulary or personal perspective to articulate the event and work toward a resolution. Self-soothing is one of the primary development tasks. For those who have lived with trauma, learning healthy ways of self-soothing is critical and will help them not to seek comfort in addictive, self-destructive ways. While John Bradshaw differentiates between healthy shame and toxic shame, Brené Brown claims that analysis of thousands of interviews from her extensive qualitative research indicates that all shame is harmful and destructive. However, Bradshaw refers to healthy shame as the exercise of discretion, a limiting factor exercised before engaging in behavior that could be shameful. Bradshaw states that healthy shame lets us know that we are limited. It tells us that to be human is to be essentially limited. Having reviewed current public perceptions and professional opinion on the psychological components of addiction, former addicts and alcoholics share their personal perspectives, confirming the internal dimensions of shame which have impacted their dependencies. Because shame prefers to remain hidden, shame triggers are not immediately evident to those seeking recovery. Shame can become disguised through a variety of emotional expression: irrational rage, indifference, anger, the overwhelming need to control, depression, confusion, flightiness, the obsession to use, numbness, panic, and the need to run. In a booklet published by Hazelden, a woman named Stephanie elaborates on her recovery and the acknowledgement of shame in her childhood. And I'll try to slow down a little bit because some of these points, these are from addicts and alcoholics in recovery. Shame and spirituality cannot exist at the same time. One cancels the other out. Shame separates us from others, from God, and from ourselves. Without spirituality, we are profoundly alone in the world. These are the feelings of shame. They depict the process that strips us of everything we know about ourselves and the world. The fact is that shame robs us of our personal growth, of spiritual consolation, and of relationships which die for lack of intimacy. We long for intimacy, yet we have no way of accepting it. Like starving children who cannot keep food down, shame strips us of all the nutrients we need to be whole human beings. Shame keeps us from loving and from being loved by others. It makes spontaneity impossible because we are so self-conscious. It seems to be the first step to giving up on life. Many of us have known shame since the cradle. Often we were bad, disciplined by having loving responses withheld as punishment. Some of us have heard ridiculous things like, "No, I'm not going to hold you because you're a bad girl." And so being bad meant being abandoned. And in a child's small world, abandonment means death. Ernest Kurtz claims that Alcoholics Anonymous teaches us fundamental first truth, the ultimate reality of personal essential limitation. Recall that shame arises from the feeling of failure, from the sense of falling short. But in the Alcoholics Anonymous understanding of the human condition, to be human is to fall short. Any therapy that would aid the alcoholic must confront the inevitability of falling short that the alcoholic, as an all-or-nothing person, sought to avoid or to deny by his use of alcohol. One who seeks to win another's love and fails suffers not the guilt of moral transgression, but the constricted hollowness of felt inadequacy. Experiences of defeat, disappointment, frustration, or failure evoke shame. AA's contribution here is to distinguish clearly between the guilty feeling of wickedness and the shame sense of worthlessness. The experience of Alcoholics Anonymous teaches that the alcoholic's key problem is not that he is wicked, but that he feels worthless. Finally, a woman born with clinical blindness reveals the deep-seated feelings of worthlessness from childhood, which eventually led to alcoholism as a young adult. From the very beginning, I felt different and unwanted. At a very young age, as children do, I had to make sense out of my life. So I came to the conclusion that I was bad, and God knew I was bad, so God made me handicapped to punish me. I thought that the undertow of sadness in my family was because of me. Later, I realized that a part of it might have been due to my handicap, but there was still a lot of grieving going on. My father turned to alcohol, and he was a very angry man. When we were growing up, He was very critical. I was told things on a daily basis like I was dumb and lazy. When I started school, I truly realized how different I was from the other children. Children were very cruel and made fun of me. I could tell you many stories of times I was treated badly, and although the stories would be different, the feeling was always the same. I was not good enough, and I hurt. From professional, academic, and personal perspectives, there is a growing evidence that unresolved shame and trauma in early childhood are closely linked to addiction and self-destructive behavior later in life. Despite the apparent paradox, these behaviors initially served as mechanisms of self-soothing, even though they can eventually lead to a wholesale destruction of quality of life and even to death. The great majority of addicts and alcoholics are not irresponsible individuals who fail to realize that the party's over. Most addicts and alcoholics are people who suffer from an intense sense of inadequacy and worthlessness, not only in the eyes of others, but also in the eyes of God. They are far removed from any degree of spiritual awareness because they feel isolated and abandoned. Because of the impact of shame, addiction is not what addicts do. It is who and what they are. Shame ingrains addiction into their very fiber. It is not necessary to point out to an addict or alcoholic the negative impact they are having on their family and friends. They remain painfully aware. From the same research studies cited above, empathy has been shown to be the most effective antidote to shame. One highly positive aspect of Alcoholics Anonymous occurs when members openly share their experience and identify themselves in the struggles of others. Tough love risks compounding existing shame in those who may be emotionally underdeveloped. A pastoral approach offering unconditional love, yet lacking any moral judgment, promises to be more effective with someone who feels entirely unworthy of love. If someone from addiction can begin to understand that we value their existence, they may come to believe in the intrinsic value residing in themselves. Thank you.
We have about 5 minutes if anybody has any questions.
So this was very inspiring, definitely. I do have comments. And when I was presenting yesterday, I mentioned trauma. So I couldn't help but connect the fall of humans to trauma, as in like our basic and first and foremost human trauma in existence. Because what happens then is Adam and Eve feel shame, they lie, they hide, and all that stuff, and then they have behaviors, obsessive and so forth. So I was relating these things, and as you were speaking about addictions, and of course I'm working with eating disorders, I know that trauma is in that iceberg underneath. It really lies underneath. It's contributing factors. It's a high kind of risk, basically, for that. And another thing is that the brain on trauma, I started mentioning that yesterday, basically. The way it functions is it gives the message, this negative thing happened, and it still is not fixed. Because our reptilian, the smallest part of our brain, doesn't make any difference between past, present, future. So it says, fix it. It's still happening. So people end up repeating and repeating and repeating the addictive cycle, the self-abuse, the self-harm. And they wonder why, and they end up blaming themselves. Whereas the evil is that mechanism, is that whatever force is pushing them towards that obsessiveness. So that was really interesting. And another thing I thought was our hostile environment, how traumatizing that is. And I am calling it hostile environment, meaning being fully aware of that because of media, because of the messages we get from the culture, that we have to be perfect, that we have to compete, that we have to succeed according to ABCD standards. So that is traumatizing. So I will just leave it at that, but that was wonderful. I'll definitely follow up later. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again very much for a great talk. For people not familiar with that distinction, the shame and guilt distinction that may put both in the same category, can you comment on the difference between these technical definitions that you've made versus colloquial sort of, I feel guilty, but that guilty feeling kind of being more of a permanent guilt, not a temporary guilt as you've defined it. Is that okay? Is that not okay? How do we engage with, I guess, putting myself in that category, people that are not educated on these distinctions? So that if I walk out of here And I don't remember that you've educated us and said there's a difference between shame and guilt, and this is shame and this is guilt, and then there's other people in that same category as I that don't make that distinction. How do we address that, I guess?
It's difficult because typically we feel guilt and shame at the same time. When we do something wrong, we feel guilty and shamed at the same time. However, guilt really does apply to a specific instance. You know, I lied to you. In that instance, I can make amends to you. I can apologize. Whereas shame is, I'm a liar. This is what I do. Now, it can become compounded. Let's say that you become accustomed, to, especially in a dysfunctional family, not to tell the truth because it brings pain to you. And so after a while, your little white lies start to add up, and you just come to the conclusion, I'm a liar. This is where, with like the 12-step program, for instance, people need to continue going through the steps because it's like the layers of an onion that you just peel back. And you can finally get to that core, which is really causing the problem. But essentially, the simplest definitions I've come across is guilt applies to action. It applies to a specific moment in time. Shame applies to self. It's a quality of me. It's an attribute of me. And because of that, I can't take care of it. I can't confess it. I can't apologize for it. It's who I am. Yes. While she's taking the microphone, usually there's a lot of questions that people have about this, and it may occur to you later. This is my email address. This is also the first academic presentation of this topic. I've given several workshops over the past year. I would really be interested in hearing from anyone that has to share. And what I could do is after I hear from everyone, I'll send a broadcast to all of you and let you know what the questions and answers were.
Thank you very much for that fascinating paper. Two questions. One, is it true that 12-step programs encourage people to identify with their addiction? So even after, say, 20 years of being sober, they still refer to themselves as a recovering alcoholic. And does that reinforce patterns of shame? That's my first question. My second question is, can you comment on how self-compassion is compatible with humility and how we can combat false notions of humility that actually reinforce shame?
Well, the first aspect, or the first question that you mentioned, I think that it actually, the fact that I have my 2-year chip in my pocket from Alcoholics Anonymous, and I do announce myself as an alcoholic. I'm Father Theodore. I'm an alcoholic. But, you know, for some people, I think it's not a good thing because it does reinforce in them over and over, I'm an alcoholic, I'm an alcoholic. And really, they're in recovery, you know. And so I think that I understand why they did it because for me, when I said it the first time, it was very liberating. You know, it really helped me to understand. But then after a while, I don't need to keep reinforcing it because I no longer drink. You know, I haven't in quite some time. About the idea of self-compassion, I didn't have any pastoral approaches in this at all because I really just wanted to address the black and white aspects of it. But in a pastoral approach, it's going to be a long-term process because a lot of the people who are suffering shame from childhood, it's going to take a long time to recover from that. It's going to take a long time for them to realize that these expectations that were set for them, you know, as children, probably don't even apply to them. You know, I recall from my own childhood that my mother would use shame, you know, to sort of control my behavior, and she would call me this or she would call me that. She only had to call me that like a couple of times, and I called myself that from then on. You know, so we have to, before we get to self-compassion, we actually just have to let them realize that what they think about themselves might not even be true. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you.